Hello and welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast. Thanks for joining me today as we finally enter the last house of the zodiac, the 12th house. And what an adventure it promises to be. I feel a certain impossibility when it comes to this episode. I feel the sense that this is the most unknowable of the houses. And so I invite you right from the beginning of this episode to do as Hercules has to do when he goes into the underworld. He has to put away the weapons that he knows, put away the tools that he knows, which for us in this current world, in this current paradigm, means we're going to need to, right at the door here, just before we enter this house, we're going to have to put away our intellect and put away our desire to understand and leave that here at the door. And instead, we're going to enter this house on its own terms, on the soul's terms. We're going to enter with the imagination, and we're going to enter through the symbols, and we're going to enter with, in the same way that if we're heading up to see the oracle, we're heading up to see the oracle of Delphi, and there's 149 maxims of Apollo on the way, just to prepare our mind, just to get us into the right mindset when we do see the oracle. Because if we go and see the oracle, the all-seeing one, and we have fixed ideas about what it is that she's going to say or what she says and what it's going to mean, what she says, then we can get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. So they took care to write many, many maxims on the way, just little trigger points for the mind. Of course, the most famous of those is know thyself, which, according to Roberto Colasso, it may have been somewhat a mistranslation, or a different translation might be look at thyself. Hence, the story of Narcissus becomes an even more interesting story if he was told not to know himself, but instead to look at himself, which is what caused him so much trouble by looking in to that lake and essentially falling for his phantom. But that's a different story altogether. And when we go up and we see these maxims and we're getting ready to see the oracle, or in other words, we're getting ready to enter the 12th house, or our own 12th house, because this is a very subjective experience being in the 12th, we see one particular maxim that ever since hearing this has really stuck with me. And that is, certainty brings ruin. Certainty brings ruin. We better remember that right here at the outset before we enter this house. Otherwise, we may do as many astrologers have done in the past and try to wrangle this house into some kind of consciousness, wrangle it into a place where it will adhere to rules that are not its rules. It has its own set of rules over here, whether that's the underworld or the other world. It has its own set of rules. Much like Inanna was told as she made her descent, hush, Inanna, the ways of the underworld are perfect. And the same can be said for the other world. Hush, Inanna, the ways of the other world are perfect. So I thought I'd prepare us for this journey with a quote from Jung. I actually opened the book Modern Man in Search of a Soul, which is a fantastic book. I'll leave a link for it in the show notes. It's a series of essays and speeches that Jung gave, each one absolutely mind-bendingly impressive on his scope. And I go to Jung because this is a man of the 20th century, one of the most profound thinkers of our time in the modern world. And he clearly spent a lot of time here in the 12th house, because essentially the 12th house is the house where we get melted down and we forge something anew, just as Hephaestus does as the smith god in the underworld, or in a cave actually under the ocean is where he has his forge. And that is where the 12th house is, in a sense, is the cave at the bottom of the ocean, far, far away from the surface world. And so we go to Jung, and I opened this book quite randomly this morning, but it didn't fail to deliver. So he says, the experience that furnishes the material for artistic expression is no longer familiar. It is a strange something that derives its existence from the hinterland of man's mind that suggests the abyss of time separating us from pre-human ages, or evokes a superhuman world of contrasting light and darkness. It is a primordial experience which surpasses man's understanding, and to which he is therefore in danger of succumbing. The value and the force of the experience are given by its enormity. It arises from timeless depths. It is foreign and cold, many-sided, demonic, and grotesque. A grimly ridiculous sample of the eternal chaos. It bursts asunder our human standards of value and of aesthetic form. The disturbing vision of monstrous and meaningless happenings that in every way exceed the grasp of human feeling and comprehension makes quite other demands upon the powers of the artist than do the experiences of the foreground of life. These never rend the curtain that veils the cosmos. They never transcend the bounds of the humanly possible, and for this reason are readily shaped to the demands of art, no matter how great a shock to the individual they may be. But the primordial experiences rend from top to bottom the curtain upon which is painted the picture of an ordered world, and allow a glimpse into the unfathomed abyss of what has not yet become. Is it a vision of other worlds, or of the obscuration of the spirit, or of the beginning of things before the age of man, or of the unborn generations of the future? We cannot say that it is any or none of these. And then he quotes Goethe here, shaping, reshaping the eternal spirit's eternal pastime. Shaping, reshaping the eternal spirit's eternal pastime. And that, essentially, is the 12th house. That is Jung speaking to something that, as he says there, as he's speaking to in this passage, he's speaking to the artist, and he's speaking to what the artist, the true artist, has to endure in order to pull together the threads that are here in this 12th house, here in the unconscious. If we're going to make art, if we're going to bring things from that formless space into form, then we need to enter it, and we need to be in it, and we need to endure it in a way, because there's nothing really about the 12th house that is ultimately all too pleasant, although there is a sort of a hint or a promise in the 12th house of a blissful state, of a unity consciousness, or of the melting of all things and the absence of the identity, in which we can feel truly liberated and truly free. And some of the characters that we actually will be visiting in the mythic part of the podcast today will show us a few hints. But in some ways, the best that we can do with the 12th is to have these hints. We can't know for sure, and to know for sure brings us back to that maxim that certainty brings ruin. That will come up as well in the interview that I do with Melanie Reinhardt. I know that a lot of you out there are very much looking forward to that episode. I am too. Our episodes on the 4th and the 8th house have been far and away the most popular of the series of the houses. And Melanie and I got together again, but as the gods would have it, in some strange metalogue, which you can find out about the word metalogue when I talk to Melanie. She uses that word a lot. Well, I'll tell you now, it essentially means the thing that we're talking about is arising as we're talking about it. That is the idea of a metalogue, very 12th house. As the gods would have it on that day, my internet was out just for 2 days because a tree had fallen here in Bali on a power line and knocked out all of the power. And although the power had come back, the internet connection had not. And so we struggled along with my phone connection as best that we could. But it has meant that that episode has certain fragments in it. And it's an unusual thing, though, because those fragments are so 12th house. And because of that, it ends up being quite a beautiful episode and a wonderful way to close out the series on the houses. Although that won't actually be the end. There will be another episode where I do a fairy tale, kind of like a 13th fairy tale in a way. And then I'll also be talking with Brian Clark, who has graciously offered to come back on the show. His episodes on this series are also the absolutely most responded to and most loved of our wrap up of the 1st to 6th and then the 7th to 12th. He's going to come up into the onto the podcast again to do kind of a wrap up of the entire series, and also to interview me about my experiences and what has changed in me along the way. So don't forget to tune in for those ones. But right now, here we are in the 12th. So I guess to anchor ourselves here, what is the 12th house? What is it? One explanation of it that I found quite useful, this is from Cafe Astrology. It says, the first line of it is, that which is hidden below the surface. That which is hidden below the surface. So like I was saying, and like Jung was saying there, it's not something that you can necessarily point directly to. It's kind of like the archetypes themselves. If you define an archetype too rigidly, then the archetype itself will wriggle free of your definition. And it may even cause some trouble along the way as it wriggles free. Yeah, because the 12th house is that which is under the surface, and therefore refers to what Jung would call the collective unconscious. And within the collective unconscious is the world of these archetypes that, as I said, cannot be pinned down. So to read here from Hillman on the topic, he says, one more word we need to introduce is archetype. The curious difficulty of explaining just what archetypes are suggests something specific to them. That is, they tend to be metaphors rather than things. We find ourselves less able to say what an archetype is, literally, and more inclined to describe them in images. We can't seem to touch one or point to one, and rather speak of what they are like. Archetypes throw us into an imaginative style of discourse. In fact, it is precisely as metaphors that Jung, who reintroduced the ancient idea of archetype into modern psychology, writes of them, insisting upon their indefinability. To take an archetypal perspective in psychology leads us, therefore, to envision the basic nature and structure of the soul in an imaginative way, and to approach the basic questions of psychology first of all by means of the imagination. So, again, what is under the surface? We're going to have to approach that with our imagination. But as we look into this 12th house and what is essentially within the astrological framework, we think of this place as certainly our dreams and the dream world. It's our private affairs. It's something very, very personal to us that we don't necessarily show. It can be known as our self-undoing, which is often if we have no contact with this part, no way of connecting to this part, then it can sort of erupt in places in our lives. And then it's also, as a place, it is away from the everyday world. So if you think of anywhere that comes to your mind of like, what is away from the everyday world? Prisons are away from everyday world. Asylums are away from them. Hospitals. These are places where some kind of like a rehabilitation is occurring, hopefully, potentially, or ideally. Or otherwise, they can be places of refuge or retreat, such as ashrams or retreats, or these places that we go. Maybe in the modern world, more like the yoga teacher training or the intensive, or wherever we're going to learn in a immersive way, where we leave the everyday world and then return to it with something new from the unconscious that we've discovered. So that is essentially what the 12th house is. To position it, we also need to bring in these other houses, right? So the other water houses are the 4th house. The 4th house is that place down around the midnight part of the chart, the place where we can find our ancestors and our root system, that which is under the ground down there. And then the 8th house, the underworld, which is a place of death and renewal, where we go through transformational experiences. But there's something in the 8th house that is a journey into the depth and then a return from the depth. And the image for the 8th house might be the caterpillar becoming the butterfly and then flying up into the 9th house with a new sense of meaning. And what differentiates the 4th and the 8th from the 12th is that the 12th is this more oceanic place. So we think less in terms of going down into the underworld, even though I will be using underworld themes within this podcast. It's more like the other world, the oceanic realm. So whilst the 8th house may have some connection to Pluto, the 12th house has a connection to Neptune. And Neptune was Poseidon in the Greek. Poseidon was the god of the sea, essentially, but also had other roles, including the god of horses and, curiously enough, the god of security. So there's something about the Neptunian consciousness that gives us the greatest possible sense of security. It's like if we can see in the way that the ocean can see, if we can connect to the oceanicness of life and to ourselves and not see it as this big chaotic mess, but see it as like a secret order exists beyond that, then it gives us the ultimate sense of security, to be who we are as we are, exactly where we are, which is a constantly morphing and changing thing, just like the ocean shows us. Now that's the triangle of the water houses. You can go back and have a listen to those ones. Of course, Melanie joins me for the 4th and the 8th, and will be joining me for the 12th, as I said. So you can join us in those watery places. Obviously, Melanie and I both really enjoy hanging out in the waters together. But then also the 12th house has that oppositional force as well. So the opposition to this place of oceanicness is the 6th house, which is our daily rituals and our routines. So the everyday world. So in a sense, the 6th and the 12th shows us the element of the 6th being the day-to-day world, and the 12th being the oceanic world, the unconscious and the conscious in a way. And the feeding in between these two, in a sense, like in the 6th house where we're creating our systems and structures, and in the 12th house we're letting them go. But in a sense, if we can move backwards and forwards between the two, then we have the best chance of having a solid mental framework. It's in the same way as a day goes, where we do all of our things in the daytime and then we have to release those into the dreams at night. It's much the same way with astrology between the 6th and the 12th. And then on either side of the 12th is also interesting. On the one side, we've just been in the 11th house, which we described as the polis, or the structures of society and the hierarchies and everything that we experience in group consciousness in the 11th. And on the other side is the 1st house, or the ascendant into the 1st house of the self. So the 12th feeds both directions, both diurnally and zodiacally. It feeds into both directions. One is the images that feed into the 11th then become the images that are structured into society. And the other way is goes through the ascendant into the 1st house as the images that structure the self. So it feeds into the idea of the self, and it also feeds the other way into the idea of society. And that's why it is such an important house, but often, in my opinion, desperately misunderstood, often left out, and almost like it's too confusing to get into. So we can kind of think about it as like, oh, it's just the unconscious, and kind of leave it at that, because it can sometimes just be too difficult for our minds to actually grasp this house. As you can hear, it is sort of like it has an ungraspable quality to it, just like archetypes, just like dreams, and just like myth. In fact, I believe that myth, in a sense, exists here in the 12th. Like this is where it happens, in which case it's constantly unraveling and unraveling on itself. A myth, as opposed to a fairy tale, will never resolve itself. It would just keep opening new doorways after new doorways and repeating certain rhyming patterns that goes through generations of characters within mythology. And to be able to be mythic or approach things in a mythic way, we have to have a lot of openness to the unconscious continuing to create new connections, rather than close them down in the way that a fairy tale might complete something and close it down and put it into some definitive place. The 12th house will never do that. Myth will never do that. And that's sort of the joy of myth in a way. Myth invites us to let go of the control, to let go of our minds, and takes us into that way of rolling with something rather than holding onto something. And then with all of that said, of course, the one who has his joy in this house is Saturn. So that's a very curious thing that Saturn should have his joy here. First of all, it feels like a bit of an oxymoron to say Saturn and joy together. Because when you think of Saturn, you don't really think of this guy as having a whole lot of joy in his life. He's very somber and very serious. And yet it is the 12th house that Saturn does revel in a sense. And so maybe we can open that up for a second here as we look into that. Why would that be? Well, the 12th house is also the house of the hermit, which I'll explore with Melanie in much more depth. Solitude, quietude. So when we're away from the everyday world, we can get down to that real quiet place. And in a sense, if we think about Saturn swallowing his children, now they survive that swallowing. So in a way, those 5 deities that go down into the belly of Saturn, they have a fully contained Saturnian golden age reality down there that they all participate in within the confines and structures of Saturn. And so down there is a quiet place, almost like a harmonious place, but it's always in threat, that harmony of a sudden eruption or something suddenly happening. In the sense of those 5 deities that are down there in the womb of the father, as essentially it is, once Metis and Zeus's medicine comes in, it disrupts the whole thing and they're all thrown back up out into the world. And we can imagine that being thrown back up out into the world as that movement from the 12th house up into the 11th house again. And we hope that we've been formed in the 12th to withstand the tests of the 11th. In the case of those 5 deities, there's a sense that they are actually pretty well formed by spending time in the womb of the mother and then the womb of the father. It would be remiss of me not to bring in Arnie Mindell yet again here. After all, that is the form of psychotherapy that I practice, process-oriented psychotherapy. There's a very simple model of reality that ends up being quite complex in the end, but it's a very simple model that Mindell brings forward, which is the idea of a layering of consciousness. And at the top layer of consciousness, he puts consensus reality. So in this level of reality, this is what we can all agree on. You might have noticed in the last little while, this ground of consensus reality has become thinner in the world than certainly I've ever known it to be. The points in which we can all agree seem to be less and less obvious. But anyway, even within your group or within your family or within your context, this is the arena of consensus. This is what we can all agree on. And then when we go down underneath that, and within process-oriented psychotherapy, we're invited to go underneath that consensus reality. We enter the dreamland. So we can imagine from there, we're going to the 11th house. Here's our consensus, and we're going down into the dreamland. And if we go deep enough through the dreaming, we may end up in the layer below that again, which is essence. In the layer of essence, I was about to say essentially, but this is the place where there's a sort of an unspeakable unity down here. It can't really be spoken of because it's so deep inside of the consciousness. It's always almost like there we've gone back into the womb, or we've even gone pre-womb into the experience of being at one with all things before we have had the sperm and the egg come together to shape us, or before we've gone through the forces of the womb, and certainly before we've made our descent from the womb down into this earth plane here and have declared ourselves as this thing, but not this thing. So before all of that is this idea of essence. And in this dreamland that Mindell talks about, oftentimes we'll get to the dreamland just by acknowledging a body symptom, or being with a synchronicity that happens in our lives, or following a line of thought, or working with a dream, working with an actual dream. It kind of invites us into like a daydreaming consciousness, which has the effect of taking us essentially into the other world, in which in that other world we can work on the things that are troubling us in this world. It's a very beautiful model. It's very achievable when it comes to a practice within the psychotherapeutic But the main thing that we have to remember when doing this kind of work is that whatever is being presented by the system is right inside of its own context, that nothing that's presented by the system is inherently wrong, that everything is responding to something else. And so once we start to work with that, then these parts of psyche, these parts of consciousness, they feel not so much condemned or not so much boxed off somewhere, and they are allowed then to show themselves. So it can be quite fun in a sense, especially when studying this form of psychotherapy with metavision. It was around 6 or 7 years ago now that I was studying with them. You'd see a big field of people acting like monsters, or getting up and making all sorts of noise, or turn into little balls on the ground and really just like following whatever the dream wanted them to follow. And I'm not talking the actual sleeping dream, I'm talking about the living dream, following that and just seeing what would occur out of that. It was really like returning to the 12th house and then getting birthed again out of that, back maybe through the ascendant and into the first house. An unusually thorough but quite playful form of therapy, and Arnie Mindell was both of those things, very thorough but also very playful, a very beautiful and wonderful trickster type. So what does that mean for us? What do we have as experiences that are outside our consensus reality, and what do we do with them? So let's say that we have a strong emotion and a strong emotional response, but we feel that emotion is not appropriate to whoever we're talking to or whatever system that we're engaged in. Then what do we do with that emotion? I mean, we use the persona to deflect that emotion, and we pretend, we use our face to try to make sure that nobody sees it, and then it heads off into the 12th. So it heads off into the unconscious. So that's how to make it really practical. Or if there's something that you see that you don't experience as part of your reality, then can you see it? You know, how much of our realities are just still happening right in front of us, but we just don't see it because we don't have a frame for it. We don't have, say, a mythic frame for it. And so it happens. I mean, I feel like everybody that's listening here has had experiences that don't fit into their everyday reality. And so they're very true at the moment that we've experienced them. And then later we think maybe that didn't really happen to me, or maybe that was a dream. And we actually argue against our own felt experience because it doesn't fit in, and there's no way to cognize it or recognize it, recognize it. We can't recognize it as a pattern, and so it heads off into the 12th. And so you can imagine down here in the 12th, over here in the 12th, in this other world, it is just as Jung said, it's full of monstrous beings and morphing creatures, shaping and reshaping, as Goethe said. There's something down here shaping and reshaping. So let's move into a little bit more mythic layering as we move into the next part of the podcast. I've got just a few myths. Of course, several myths were coming to the door. Many myths want to be told into the 12th, and it's almost like you could use any myth here, it seems. But I've plucked out just a few to help us anchor in through the mythic. And I want to start with Hercules. And as we know about Hercules, he was given his 12 labors of redemption, essentially. And we're going to join him as he enters his 12th labor. And his 12th labor was to bring back the three-headed dog with a snake's tail, god of the underworld. So you can hear the Saturnian component of this creature. And one of the monsters that actually comes down through the lineage of Medusa and Poseidon as essentially this creature's great grandparents. And the dog is called either Cerberus or Cerberus. And I've heard both of those used, and I've seen them written both ways. So if you say Cerberus, go ahead and keep saying Cerberus. I'm going to say Cerberus. Either way, the sound of it seems like it comes back to the word cerebral, even though I haven't found any evidence of that. So we'll use that as a bit of folk etymology, that there's something about the three-headedness and the cerebral of this dog. So you can imagine the fierceness of this creature who has three heads, very violently guarding the entrance to the underworld. We know that if we are going to go there, we're going to have to go through something quite terrifying like this monstrous being. And Hercules is sent down there to take on this dog and to bring it back, essentially. So before he could actually go on this journey, Hercules first needed to go through the Eleusinian mysteries, but he had not been purified of the killing of the centaurs. So this is interesting, that the killing of the centaurs that happened when the jar of Dionysian wine was open and the injuring of Chiron, that moment when he wounded, even though those centaurs were feral, even though they were attacking, and even though it was in self-defense, they were still hanging over him, those deaths. The deaths of the wild was still hanging over him. So he had to go through a ritual of purification, and then he was allowed to go through the mysteries. I think this is actually very much a 12th house theme. This is in the 12th where we return to innocence, when we go through our purifications, when we understand on some deep level, not on a conscious level, but on some deep soul level, why we did the things that we did. And we come into a sort of state of this word remorse, which is French, which means to take another bite. Like we take another bite of the things that we've done. We come into some kind of a redemption arc with our deepest regrets in our life, and we hopefully make some kind of peace with them. And so the first thing that happens on his way down there is he sees Medusa and some other monsters. And he pulls out his sword, he starts swinging it wildly at Medusa, and Hermes is there. Hermes, guide of souls, is there to say, Hercules, no, that's not the real Medusa, that's just a phantom of Medusa. And so he has to make this discernment on his way down there as what is real and what is not real, what is real and what's a phantom. And it's not going to be that he can use his logical mind in order to discern that. He needs to be able to use other senses, because the ways of this world are not the same as the day world. We cannot use those weapons. They just are useless to us. And so he goes beyond Medusa, and who does he see down there but our old friend Theseus. Theseus, who I will actually be discussing next in this podcast. Theseus is sitting there with his friend Pirithous. Now, how did those two get down there? And what are they doing down there? Well, one day, Theseus and Pirithous, typical heroes that they are, started to play a game of truth and dare. And the dares started to get more and more outrageous and more absurd. And they kept on keeping on with these dares until eventually the dare was put by Pirithous to Theseus that they would go and storm the underworld and bring back Persephone from the underworld. This was the dare. This is when a game of truth and dare really goes awry. This is where you've got to stop that game. But Theseus is the kind of hero that would never shy away from a challenge. And so off they go, the two of them, with all their boisterousness. And now they do not have the guidance of Hermes. They do not have the kind of guides that Hercules has on his labors. It's almost as though the gods really wanted Hercules to achieve all of these labors. They were behind him. They wanted him to get where he wanted to get to. Now, these two heroes, however, were receiving no help, and they went down with all their blusteringness and all their egos down into the underworld. They got past Cerberus somehow, and then they met with Hades, just as they were about to go into the chamber of Persephone and take her out of there. And Hades said, gentlemen, what are you doing down here? And Theseus said, well, we've come for Persephone. Don't try to stand in our way. And then Hades was like, oh, interesting. Yeah, okay, just take a seat and I'll go get her. And he put them in the seat of forgetfulness. So each of them was put in the seat of forgetfulness. And then in this seat, they couldn't get out of the seat. They were strapped in. And they was just sitting there going, hang on, what? Why exactly did we come down here? Or where exactly is this here that we are? I remember sometime we were hanging out, just playing some games, and they started to get caught in a forgetful stupor, essentially. And this is actually a very relevant little side story here, because this is something that can also happen in the 12th house in this other world. If you've ever done the psychedelic journeys of healing, and the healing modalities of psychedelics, then you can sometimes know what it's like to get caught in this very chair. It may not even be a metaphorical chair for you. You may have actually sat down here and not been quite sure exactly where you were, why you were there, or for that matter, how to get out of there. So Hercules then sees them there, and he tries to help them, and so he pulls with all of his might and wrenches Theseus from the chair, which Theseus is very grateful for being saved from his condition of stupor. And then he goes to Pirithous and he tries to get him, but the earth shakes and rumbles and he can't bring Pirithous out. So Pirithous, even to this day, is an image of staying there. He's still there on that chair, but Theseus is out and gets to go ahead and do whatever he needs to do on his heroic journeys. He thanks Hercules, and he hopefully learnt his lesson about the underworld and the rules down there, and heads back to the upper world. And so then Hercules finally makes it down to Hades and speaks to him and begs him, or asks him, for Cerberus. And Hades gives him the instruction that if he can defeat him without any of his weapons that he carried, he can take him. This is really 12th house knowing. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, this is what we understand about the 12th, that our regular tools won't help us here. We need to put everything down, and then we need to just wrestle, whatever it is. We need to just go face to face with whatever it is, with the monstrous side, with the three heads. I mean, that can be who we find here in the 12th house as well, a three-headed animal with a snake's tail, making all sorts of noise and ruckus. And so Hercules then has to move towards this dog, and without any of his weapons, without any of his skill sets, has to just wrestle bare hand, and goes at one of the necks, while two of the other heads are biting him and the snake's tail is injuring him. He still manages to subdue this creature and bring him back to the surface world, and then bring him back down, and that labor is completed. So that's Hercules. And then we're going to follow Theseus. He's heading back up to the upper world. But of course, we're going to go back in time, and we're going to go to a story that I mentioned on the podcast with Brian Clark when we spoke about Ariadne. So whilst we can see in the water houses, and Brian Clark talks about this, and I'm sure I will get this slightly wrong from what he says about it, but we see that down in the 4th house is the whole family conundrum that we're born into, the whole sort of dilemmas within the family unit of which we're born. And then we move into the 8th house. It's the sense of the thread that is given to the hero. So we join forces in a sense with another in the 8th house, and we try to get through that labyrinth together. And then hopefully we do that, setting ourselves free of the labyrinth. But that's also it can be a betrayal of the family system. In that way, both Theseus and Ariadne have to then leave. And so something very, very much a theme of 12th houseness is the theme of exile. And so now, if we follow Ariadne through this story, we can feel her as she's assisted the hero with this thread, and then therefore been a participant in the death of her brother, her half-brother, essentially, the Minotaur, who's died at the hands of the hero. And so then she's had to be exiled. She's essentially abandoned herself of her birthright into that kingdom. And in the betrayal of that, she's moved her story on, and she's gone with the hero off to Naxos. Of course, as the story goes, around 4 a.m., when the sun is perhaps in the 2nd house, maybe the 3rd house into the 2nd, in that cusp there of the exit to the underworld, as it's known in the diurnal motion, Theseus leaves. And he leaves on his boat with his sails. And not only that, but a real kick to the whole thing is that he leaves with Ariadne's sister. So she has the most devastating of betrayals. And she watches the sea, and she watches that boat as it drifts off and away. And she watches the sails, and it's gone. And there she is on Naxos, on an island in the middle of the ocean, completely abandoned. She has abandoned her family, and she has been abandoned by her lover. And there she is all alone. This is the isolation of the 12th. And this is the solitude of the 12th. And this is the devastation of the 12th. In some ways, our ability to be with this kind of a consciousness, this 12th house consciousness, is the test of soul. If we can come in touch with this part of ourselves that feels abandoned by the gods, that feels like we have abandoned something very essential, if we can come in touch with this place and be with it, then we do what James Hillman called soul making. And soul making is this moment of Ariadne as she stands there on the shore and stares at the sea. Of course, she moves from that place to the middle of the island, and there she discovers Dionysus. And she discovers the meaning behind it all through her meeting with Dionysus. And Dionysus is the one that loosens the binds of reality and takes us back to something that doesn't have all of that programming around it. And something of the connection between Ariadne and Dionysus is like an essential connection. In fact, in the Latin, Dionysus was called Liber and Ariadne was called Libera. So we have this sense of like liberty, of freedom, of the unshackling of the chains that happens when the two of them get together. And that's certainly a potentiality in the 12th house if we can move through those very tough and harsh feelings and not lose ourselves in the feelings themselves. If we can stay with Saturn anchored in the middle of this island and not get caught out of the edges where the sea is, then we may be able to find our counterpart there or something essential of ourselves. And I think about that with Ariadne. Her destiny was not to be in the land of Minos, in the land of Crete, in this place where her father, the king, had accepted the great white bull from the ocean, but not returned it, had essentially put a curse upon the whole kingdom, which had led to the labyrinth, which had led to all of this chaos that had occurred in that place. Her destiny was not to remain there. But then she thought that her destiny was to be with Theseus and head off into this, partner of the heroic, partner of the ego, essentially. But that wasn't it either. She needed to use the egoic consciousness or the heroic consciousness in order to leave behind what was there. But then that wasn't the end of her story. In the end of her story, she ends up right back in the 12th, and I consider her as Libera to be goddess of the 12th house, as Ariadne that is there in the 12th. And if we look up at the stars, we might see Corona Borealis, and that is Ariadne's crown. And it was a crown given to Ariadne by Dionysus, and that was the crown to suggest that she was the queen of these Dionysian states. She was the queen, in a sense, of the 12th house, the queen of the unconscious. And there's another version of the story, and it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly how it goes chronologically, because it doesn't make a lot of sense that way, but this is myth. There's a version of the story that instead of a thread, it's this crown that Ariadne gives to Theseus. And with the crown, it lights up the dark tunnels, and so that he can see in the labyrinth, and then he can go and achieve his task of killing the Minotaur and coming back out and freeing the youths and the maidens that were going to get sacrificed to the Minotaur, and essentially standing up for the innocents by a bright and starry crown. Therefore, that crown would have been given by Dionysus to Ariadne to give to Theseus. So you can get the sense that maybe, just maybe, there was some greater plan at play where Ariadne and even Theseus was in on the rescuing of Ariadne and delivering her to her true home, which is Naxos, and her true place, which is with Dionysus as queen of the 12th. And then the last of the gods that we'll explore today before closing up our 12th house wanderings and dreamings and swimmings is the god Hephaestus. Now, I explored Hephaestus in another podcast with my friend Jeff Tsai, and his podcast is called How Humans Work. And you can go and have a listen to that. I'll put, again, the link in the show notes there. But we explore Hephaestus in the sense of 11th and 5th dynamics. But I'm going to take Hephaestus with me into the 12th here and have a look at him from that angle. So Hephaestus was, in a sense, the 12th of the Olympians. If there are 12, he was the 12th. He's kind of like the last of them, and is often overlooked and very much not very well known. And it's understandable as well, because when he was born, he was lame, and Hera, his mother, he's actually a child, a son of Hera and Zeus. And there aren't so many of those, but when he was born, he was lame of foot. And Hera, furious that he wasn't perfect, cast him out from Olympus. And it is said that he felt 9 days and 9 nights until he landed in the ocean. 9 days and 9 nights. That is the time it takes for the anvil to drop from Olympus to the earth, and the same amount of time it takes for the anvil to drop again from the earth down to Tartarus, which is the deepest place of the underworld. So that gives you a sense of the how the Greek world saw the separations of these realms. And so we can imagine ourselves in the 9 days and 9 nights. What's this 9 number? It's a sort of a sense of gestation again. It's a sense of a pregnant time, which is very womb-like, which is very 12th house-like, this tumbling and turning, this falling, this confusion, this sense of not knowing what way is up or down or round. And that's how he falls. It's an experience that I'm sure we've all felt. I mean, I know we've all felt because we've all been in a womb, but also we've gone through that in our lives, I'm sure, where the rug gets pulled from under our feet, or we feel like we've been exiled or sent out or sent away from something that we really cherished. And you can imagine Hephaestus, it's not his fault that he's lame of foot. That's not something that he chose for himself, and yet he's being punished for that. And so he falls and falls and falls in his own devastation. And he lands in the ocean, but he's found by 2 oceanids. One is actually the mother of Achilles, Thetis, and the other is Eurynome. And so these 2 oceanids come and take care of him and take him in. And where they take him is down, down, down under the ocean into a cave at the bottom of the ocean. And it's in this cave at the bottom of the ocean that he is safe. And he spends a lot of time there, and he heals, and he's away from the world. And he can move through this oceanic consciousness. He can move through all that he's been through. In this space, it's like there's no prying from the upper world. There's no sense of anything coming in from the upper world and tearing him apart again. He's able to just be with what's happened to him. And over time, he realizes that he has a gift. Or maybe Thetis helps him to figure out that he has a gift. His gift is something very special. He's an alchemist, but specifically, he's a metal worker or a metalsmith. It's the sacred art of metallurgy. Now, this is written about extensively by Mircea Eliade in his book called The Forge and the Crucible. And it's this idea of taking those raw materials of the below world and turning them into something beautiful and also functional. And that's what Hephaestus does. Sure, he makes some beautiful jewelry, but he also creates the chariots for the gods. He creates the palaces for the gods. He creates so many different things for the gods, and including armor and swords and shields. All of these things have a certain craft on them, where he uses also the myths themselves and embroiders them in gold onto all these things. So if you can get that picture of just how stunning and beautiful his creations actually are, all of them not just beautiful but also functional. Down in this place, he also creates for himself something very relevant to the modern day, which are these golden helpers. They're sort of like robotic helpers that help him with his metalwork. So they're essentially AI, but maybe 2,500 plus years ago. So, and also the Cyclopses with their one eyes. He has 3 Cyclopses often who are making big sounds and bashing away at things and helping him down there. So he has a lot of help. He even makes these little tripods that help him to walk. So he's really a master of the robotics and of artificial intelligence, and he's able to put consciousness into these things and have them help him. But one of the things that he makes is a golden throne that he sends up to Hera. And when she sits on this golden throne, much like Theseus and Pirithous, she's stuck in place. And then everybody becomes quite stressed because Hera, the mother, the queen is now trapped in this golden throne. And there's a lot that you can do with that mythically or psychologically. And I'll leave you to imagine your own way through that one. But then all of the gods are very concerned, not only that Hera's stuck there, but also they kind of miss this guy and they've seen that he's been making beautiful things and they invite him back, but he's not interested in coming back. He's very upset still that he's been cast out, and so he has no interest. So who do they send? Of course, they send Dionysus. And Dionysus opens up a jar of his favorite wine with him, and slowly over time, the two of them, well, not Dionysus, he tends to not get drunk, but Hephaestus gets quite drunk and comes with him in order to come back to the upper world. Hephaestus is riding a donkey, and Dionysus is walking in front of him. And I imagine in this scene, because it's only really pictured on vases in the ancient world, it's not really written anywhere. I imagine in this scene that there's all sorts of merriment happening as well. There's a lot of music. Every step that Dionysus takes, there's roses and flowers and nature growing all around him. And Hephaestus is brought back on this donkey of all things, brought back almost in a festival of the absurd or a feast of fools. And he's brought back from the 12th back into the world. And I think in a way that's our lame part, right? That's our monstrous part. That's the part that has secret gold, secret abilities that we've left here in the 12th. That's the part of exile. That's our hermit. And if we can find ways to get that one in an altered state, we might be able to bring him or her or it back from that place so that it can have its place in the world again. I think that that feels true on the individual level, but certainly true on the world level and on the psychic level. Because those that are in the unconscious, the way that they'll want to come back is through disturbance. And if we can go with that disturbance, if we can go find them, we can instead bring them up on an ass, and we can bring them back with music and revelry, and we can bring them back with laughter and humor and include them in the world again. But we can't really talk about Hephaestus in full without talking about his wife Aphrodite. Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and pleasure and desire, who was married off to this lame smith god, really against her will. And Aphrodite didn't really appreciate this relationship. It wasn't her choice, and it's not something that she dedicated to herself to at all. And so instead of being with Hephaestus, she instead had lovers, and the greatest of her lovers was certainly Ares. And this is the connection between Mars and Venus, Ares and Aphrodite. The tension between those two and the polarity between those two is an essential polarity, is the erotic polarity. But it was all done in secret. It was all done hidden. It was another element of this 12th house of things that are in the hidden realms. And so their love affair, they tried to keep secret. But of course, Hephaestus, as he is, as we've heard, he has spent a lot of time in a cave under the ocean. So he has a pretty sharp sense of intuition. He's able to see things from that watery place. And so he knows what they're up to. And so one day he decided to use his craft to trap them. And he created a very, very thin cage and hid it above the bed of his marriage chamber, the bed that he shares with Aphrodite, and then made a big scene about how he's going back to Lemnos, he's going to visit old family and friends, and he'd be away for quite some time, perhaps for several weeks, thus giving them time to do whatever they were going to do. And it didn't take Ares and Aphrodite much time at all. They got straight to it. And that's when Hephaestus turned back around and caught them in the act. So just as Ares and Aphrodite are lying there on the marriage bed, a net, bronze net, very finely wrought, invisible to the naked eye, fell on them, and they were trapped in place. And Hephaestus then called all of the gods, not the goddesses, but just all of the gods, to come and stare and to look and to draw shame upon these two for what they're up to, shame on them for their secrecy and for their affair. And so it's a very tense scene as all of the gods are gathered around. But of course, with the gods stands Hermes, the trickster god, also the psychopomp. And Apollo asks Hermes what he thinks about the scene. And Hermes turns back to Apollo, his brother, and says, I would take 3 times the amount of chains, and I'd be there for 1,000 years if only I got to lay with Aphrodite. That little quip, that little joke brought a murmur and a laughter, and then suddenly Hephaestus's plan was a failed plan, and the humor and the laughter and the titillation ends up spreading itself throughout the gods, and Hephaestus's plan to bring shame is ruined. And perhaps it is shame that we can find here in the 12th as well. Shame that is hidden here in this house. Shame of certain things that we feel, certain things that we are, parts of the consciousness that are not allowed. And it is this humor, much like the donkey that brings Hephaestus back. It is the absurdity. It is the humor that helps us to move through these shameful places. And so with Hercules, we met that threshold guardian, otherwise known as Saturn. We met him in his monstrous form as a 3-headed dog with a snake's tail, antagonistic towards us. With his 3 heads, he tells us nasty stories about how worthless we are, how we should just give up. Nobody wants you, nobody cares for you. On and on his 3 heads go, never ending. When we wrestle with him and bring him up to the light on a leash, he becomes our greatest ally and helper. Our deepest primordial instincts are in check. And then we remember that it was Saturn as Cronus that represented Gaia, who stood up against an oppressive force, who took action when his 11 siblings would rather stay silent and allow the atrocities to continue. It was Saturn who then ruled over the Golden Age, a timeless age that we might remember in ourselves, when the laws of nature and the laws of mankind were in an unspoken harmony, where the consequences for crossing a natural boundary were instant, and where man knew his limits. It's that one who becomes our ally, allowing us to draw a clear ring around ourselves and say, this is I, and this is not I. With Ariadne, we touched the thread, the softest thing in the kingdom, and felt the unending, unbroken fabric of reality that connects the ancient past and the distant future into this moment. With that thread, we navigated a maze of confusion and delusion, hidden monsters, trap doors, and wrong turns, to confront another hybrid creature in the center. When we stared down that bull's head, we used the corona borealis, the crown of stars, that connected us all the way back to the clear vision of the starry sky. With that vision, we saw the Minotaur in the mirror. What happened in there between you and the Minotaur is your secret to unravel into your life. Through Ariadne, we discovered Dionysus again, exiled as he was on Naxos, who then went about getting Hephaestus tipsy, loosening him up a little, and bringing him back to Olympus. Hephaestus, the wounded metalsmith who works at a forge deep in the earth. He makes palaces and temples for the gods, as we might encourage our 12th house planets to do. But he also creates traps, a throne that sticks the goddess to her place, an invisible net that locks down Ares and Aphrodite. Walt Whitman, in his poem Song of Myself from Leaves of Grass, delivered to us the following often quoted line. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. What does it mean to contain multitudes? Saturn contains, Neptune is the multitudes. They are together in the sky at this moment, and they are both associated with this 12th house. Do we contain the multitudes as a trap, as a prison? Or do we build them palaces so that they may be honored, whether we like them or not, whether they bring us gifts or curses? The next line in Whitman's song is, I concentrate toward them that are nigh. I wait on the door slab. Here he gives us an image of the ascendant, the part of the chart that boldly says 2 fateful words, I am. The ascendant is on the eastern horizon at the moment we are born. Here we go back and stand with Ariadne staring at the sea as the heroic ship glides gently into the sunrise. In front of us is longing and desire for the great heroic quest of life. Behind us is the unknown, unable to turn back, unclear on how to move forward. We wait on Whitman's door slab, or as it was called in ancient times, the limen, the space between worlds. At that edge between the joy of Saturn of the 12th house and the joy of Mercury in the 1st house, we are asked to concentrate toward them that are nigh. those who have been forged in the crucible of the 12th, that have had their time in the quiet solitude of Saturn's belly, ready to be reborn, ready for another cycle. And it's here, full circle, that we complete the journey of the houses, anchoring ourselves in the chaos of it all, as Dionysus encourages us to do. Down the birth canal we go, or regurgitated up through Saturn's mouth, as we make our way on donkey back into this absurd world. Thank you for joining me for the tour of the houses. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Our next episode will be with Melanie Reinhardt. That'll be out next week. It's another profound deep dive into a waterhouse with Melanie. And after that, we'll have Brian Clark. And there will be one more fairy tale to go to close up this series of the 12 houses of astrology. Thanks for joining me. See you next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.